In the quiet fields of Essex, down a narrow country lane, there once stood a farmhouse that seemed, from the outside, to belong to a gentler kind of story. It was not a castle, not a ruin, not a place anyone would have expected to become famous. It was a working family home, surrounded by land, barns, outbuildings, and the deep stillness of the English countryside. At night, the darkness around it was almost complete. A few lights in distant cottages, the sound of trees shifting in the wind, the low hush of animals and fields settling after sunset. Inside that house lived a family whose lives, like most families, were more complicated than they appeared from the lane. There were old tensions, private worries, money, inheritance, illness, distance, affection, resentment, faith, memory. All the ordinary human things that can gather quietly over years, until, from the outside, no one can see the weight of them anymore. Then, in the early hours of a summer morning in 1985, a telephone call sent police toward that isolated farmhouse. The caller said something was terribly wrong. He said his father had called him from the farmhouse. He said there was a gun. He said his sister had lost control. And by the time officers finally entered the house, 5 members of one family were dead. At first, the explanation seemed clear to police. It seemed tragic but simple. A troubled young woman, a family destroyed in one night, a final act inside a locked and silent farmhouse. But the more people looked, the less simple it became. A missing piece of equipment was found days later. A former girlfriend changed her statement. Relatives began to doubt the first theory. Investigators reconsidered what they thought they knew. And, slowly, the story turned away from the woman first blamed for the tragedy, and toward the only immediate family member still alive. This is not a story about a haunted house, but it is a story about a house that has never quite released its shadows. Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're looking at the White House Farm case, one of the most discussed and debated British true crime cases of the 20th century. As always, this story is told calmly and respectfully, with no graphic detail, no sensational framing, and no attempts to turn real suffering into entertainment. The people at the center of this case were not characters in a drama. They were a family. They were parents, a daughter, a son, and 2 young children. Their names deserve to be spoken with care. The case took place near Tollis Hunt Darcy in Essex, England, during the night of August 6th to August 7th, 1985. The victims were Nevill and June Bamber, their adopted daughter, Sheila Caffell, and Sheila's twin sons, Daniel and Nicholas. Jeremy Bamber, Nevill and June's adopted son, was later convicted of all 5 murders. He has always maintained his innocence. So tonight, we'll move slowly. We'll begin with the family and the farmhouse. Then we'll follow the night itself, the first theory, the investigation, the evidence that changed the direction of the case, the trial, and the long debate that has continued ever since. Settle in, lower the lights, and let the story unfold at an unhurried pace. White House Farm stood near the village of Tollis Hunt Darcy in Essex, an area of open fields, small lanes, old hedgerows, and scattered houses. It was not far from other communities, but at night, in the right weather, it could feel very separate from the world. The house itself was a substantial farmhouse, connected to the long history of a farming family. It was the home of Ralph Nevill Bamber, known as Nevill, and his wife, June. Nevill was a farmer, a former Royal Air Force pilot, and a local magistrate. June came from a family with land and property. Together, they had built a life that appeared stable, prosperous, and deeply rooted in place. But family histories are rarely as smooth as they look in photographs. Nevill and June were unable to have biological children, so they adopted 2 children as infants. First came Sheila, Later came Jeremy. Sheila and Jeremy were not biologically related, but they grew up as brother and sister within the same family, in the same orbit of expectations, money, religion, and rural life. Sheila was striking, sensitive, and often described by people who knew her as beautiful. As a young woman, she worked as a model and was sometimes known by the nickname Bambi. She married Colin Caffell, and together they had twin sons, Daniel and Nicholas, born in 1979. But the marriage did not last. Sheila and Colin separated, and the boys spent time between family members. Sheila also struggled with her mental health. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had received psychiatric care. In later retellings of the case, this diagnosis would become one of the most discussed and misused details in the entire story. It shaped the first police theory, and it shaped public assumptions. But it is important to say clearly, mental illness does not make someone violent by default, and a diagnosis is not proof of guilt. June Bamber was deeply religious. Some family members and accounts have described her beliefs as intense and sometimes difficult for those around her. Sheila's former husband, Colin, later expressed concern about the effect that June's religious views had on the children. Within the family, there were long-running tensions, especially around expectations, parenting, emotional closeness, and money. Jeremy Bamber, the adopted son, was 24 in 1985. He had been privately educated and was connected to the family's farming and business interests, though his relationship with his parents was complicated. The Bamber estate included valuable assets, including farmland and a caravan site. At trial, the prosecution would later argue that inheritance was central to the motive. But before the courtroom, before the headlines, before the arguments about motive and evidence, there was simply the family. Nevill, practical and physically strong, a man used to the rhythms of farm life. June, devout and sometimes troubled, holding tightly to her beliefs. Sheila, vulnerable, artistic, and navigating illness, motherhood, and family pressure. Daniel and Nicholas, 6 years old, still at the very beginning of life. And Jeremy, the son who would become the focus of one of Britain's most controversial murder cases. In early August 1985, Sheila and the boys were staying at White House Farm. On the evening of August 6th, Jeremy had dinner there with his family. At some point later, he left the farmhouse and returned to his own home in Goldhanger, a village a few miles away. The house settled into darkness, the fields quieted, and sometime before dawn, the first version of the story began with a phone call. In the early hours of August 7th, 1985, Jeremy Bamber contacted police. He did not call the emergency number directly. He called Chelmsford Police Station. He told them that his father, Nevill, had phoned him from White House Farm and said that Sheila had gone berserk with a gun. Jeremy said the call had then gone dead. That claim would become one of the central questions in the case. Had Nevill really called Jeremy? Or had Jeremy invented that call to create the first outline of a false story? At that moment, police did not know. Officers were sent toward White House Farm. Jeremy also made his way there. The farmhouse was quiet when police arrived. There was concern that someone inside might still be armed. Officers waited outside for several hours before entering. This delay has been discussed many times in later accounts, because Jeremy's defense has argued that events inside the house may not have been fully understood during that waiting period. The prosecution, however, would later argue that the deaths had already occurred before Jeremy raised the alarm. When police eventually entered White House Farm, they found Nevill, June, Sheila, Daniel, and Nicholas dead. A rifle was found near Sheila. The early police theory was that Sheila had killed her family and then died by her own hand. Because Sheila had a known mental health history, This theory was accepted quickly by some investigators and repeated in early media coverage. But the scene was not treated with the level of care that would be expected in a major murder inquiry today. Because police initially believed they were dealing with a murder-suicide, the farmhouse was not preserved as thoroughly as it should have been. Later, this would become a major issue. Evidence had been moved. The scene had been entered by multiple people. Some searches were incomplete. Some items would become important only after the first theory began to fall apart. For the surviving relatives, the shock was immediate and profound. For the police, the case seemed, at first, to have an answer. But within days, doubts began to gather. One of the most important doubts concerned a sound moderator, commonly called a silencer, connected to the rifle. It was not found with the weapon when police first entered the house. It was discovered 3 days later, in a gun cupboard by a member of the extended family. The prosecution later argued that this item was crucial, because, if it had been attached to the rifle, Sheila could not have used the weapon to end her own life, in the way first assumed. There were also questions about the telephone call Jeremy said he had received from his father. The prosecution would later argue that Nevill could not have made that call, and that the kitchen phone did not support Jeremy's version of events. Jeremy's defense has continued to argue that the phone call, or possible phone evidence from inside the farmhouse, supports his innocence. And then there was the human evidence. In the first days after the killings, people watched Jeremy. Some relatives later said they found aspects of his behavior troubling. Behavior after a death is always difficult to interpret, because grief does not look the same in every person. Some people collapse. Some go numb. Some act in ways that seem strange, because shock has made normal behavior impossible. But in this case, those impressions contributed to growing suspicion. Then, about a month after the deaths, Jeremy's former girlfriend, Julie Mugford, gave police a new statement, and the case changed completely. Julie Mugford had been in a relationship with Jeremy Bamber. At first, she did not give police the statement that would later become so important. But on September 7th, 1985, after the relationship had deteriorated, she told investigators that Jeremy had spoken about planning to kill his family. The next day, Jeremy was arrested. Her evidence became a central part of the prosecution case. According to the prosecution, Jeremy had not been an innocent son receiving a desperate call from his father. Instead, they argued, he had returned to White House Farm after dinner, killed his family, staged the scene to make it look as though Sheila was responsible, and then raised the alarm from his own home. The prosecution's suggested motive was inheritance. Nevill and June had significant assets, and Jeremy stood to benefit financially if the rest of the immediate family was gone. The prosecution argued that money, resentment, and planning formed the background to the crime. Jeremy denied this. He said Julie Mugford was lying because their relationship had broken down. He insisted he loved his family and had not killed them. His account remained that his father had called him, frightened and urgent, and that Jeremy had contacted police afterward. The investigation focused on several key areas. The first was the sound moderator. The prosecution said it had been attached to the rifle during the killings, then removed and returned to the gun cupboard. Traces found inside it were interpreted as supporting its use. The prosecution's argument was that Sheila could not have used the rifle on herself with the moderator attached, and that if she had removed it, there was no clear reason she would have returned it downstairs before dying upstairs. The second key area was the phone evidence. Jeremy's account required Nevill to have called him from the farmhouse. The prosecution argued that this did not happen. The question of whether there was one call, two calls, or some other telephone activity has remained one of the case's enduring controversies. In later years, campaigners and journalists have pointed to police logs and disputed call evidence as possible reasons to doubt the conviction, while courts and review bodies have not accepted those points as enough to overturn it. The third area was Sheila herself. The original theory relied on the idea that Sheila was responsible, but investigators later questioned whether she had the physical ability, emotional state, and opportunity to carry out everything attributed to her. The prosecution emphasized the practical difficulties of the first theory. The defense emphasized that police had first believed that theory for a reason. The fourth area was Jeremy's conduct before and after the deaths. Prosecutors presented evidence about money, family property, and conversations. They also relied heavily on Julie Mugford's testimony. The defense attacked her credibility, noting her personal conflict with Jeremy and other issues that, in their view, made her unreliable. By the time the case reached trial in 1986, the story had become two competing narratives. In one, Sheila, in a state of severe mental disturbance, had killed her parents and children, and then died by her own hand. In the other, Jeremy had carefully planned and staged the murders, using Sheila's illness as the cover. The jury would be asked to decide which story the evidence supported. Jeremy Bamber's trial opened at Chelmsford Crown Court in October 1986. He was charged with 5 counts of murder. The prosecution case was led by Anthony Arledge, QC, and the defense by Jeffrey Rivlin, QC, with Ed Lawson, QC. The trial lasted 18 days. The prosecution built its case around motive, opportunity, the sound moderator, Julie Mugford's testimony, and what it said were inconsistencies in Jeremy's account. They argued that Jeremy had used his father's rifle, staged the scene, and then invented the phone call from Nevill. The defense argued that the police had been right the first time. Sheila's illness, the locked house circumstances, and Jeremy's call to police all supported, in their view, the original explanation. They challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the sound moderator and questioned the reliability of Julie Mugford. On October 28, 1986, Jeremy Bamber was convicted by a majority verdict of 10-2. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Later, he was given a whole life order, meaning he was not expected to be released. For many people, that was the end of the case. But for others, it was only the beginning of a second story, the story of appeals, disputed evidence, and a conviction that some continue to question. In 2002, the Court of Appeal considered a major appeal after the Criminal Cases Review Commission had referred the case back. The appeal raised many issues, including forensic questions connected to the sound moderator and claims about disclosure and evidence handling. The Court of Appeal dismissed the appeal and upheld the convictions. In its judgment, the court concluded that the jury had been entitled to convict. After that, Jeremy Bamber continued to seek further review. The CCRC rejected later applications, including one in 2012, saying it had not found new evidence or argument that created a real possibility the conviction would be quashed. In 2021, a new application was lodged. In July 2025, the CCRC reportedly refused to refer 4 of 10 grounds back to the Court of Appeal, while other grounds remained under review. The case also returned to public attention through investigative reporting. Recent reporting has focused on questions about call evidence, the sound moderator, police handling of evidence, and whether the original case against Jeremy Bamber was as secure as courts have found it to be. Some experts and campaigners have challenged aspects of the forensic case, particularly around the sound moderator. But as of the latest reliable reporting, Jeremy Bamber's conviction remains in place. That is the difficult balance at the heart of White House Farm. Legally, the case is solved. Emotionally, historically, and publicly, it remains unsettled for many. White House Farm is often remembered as a mystery. But before it was a mystery, it was a family tragedy. That is easy to lose. The arguments are absorbing. The timeline, the phone call, the sound moderator, The statements, the appeals, the court judgments, the campaign materials, the documentaries, the newspaper investigations. The question of whether the first police theory was abandoned for good reason, or whether the later theory became too fixed in place. But beneath all of that are 5 people who did not live beyond that August morning. Nevill Bamber, who had worked the land and built a life in the Essex countryside. June Bamber, whose faith and inner struggles shaped the emotional world of her family. Sheila Caffell, remembered by some as glamorous, fragile, funny, difficult, loving and unwell, but too often reduced to a diagnosis. Daniel and Nicholas Caffell, 6-year-old boys whose lives should never be remembered only through the crime that took them. And Jeremy Bamber, the surviving son, convicted of murdering them all, still maintaining his innocence after decades in prison. The house itself became a symbol, not because it looked frightening, not because there was anything supernatural about it, but because it seemed to hold every version of the story at once. A quiet farmhouse under a dark sky. A phone ringing in the early hours. Police waiting outside, not yet knowing what had happened within. A first explanation, accepted quickly. A second explanation, built slowly. A trial, a conviction, a lifetime of appeals, and a question that still lingers in the minds of many who study the case. Did the justice system correct an early mistake, or did it replace one mistake with another? The courts have answered that question. They have upheld the conviction. The legal record says Jeremy Bamber is guilty, but the public conversation has never fully gone silent. Perhaps that is because White House Farm contains the kind of uncertainty that true crime often leaves behind. Not always uncertainty about the verdict itself, but uncertainty about process, about what was preserved and what was lost, about what was assumed too quickly, about whether a scene, once disturbed, can ever speak clearly again. And so the farmhouse remains, in memory, as a place of stillness and argument, a place where the countryside was quiet, a place where a family story ended before dawn, a place where, decades later, people are still listening for the truth in the spaces between the official record and the unanswered questions. Thank you for listening. Tonight's case was the White House Farm murders, also known as the Jeremy Bamber case. As always, remember the victims first. Nevill, June, Sheila, Daniel, and Nicholas. May they be remembered with dignity. And may every retelling of this case keep their humanity at the center. Rest well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next quiet story.